are you ready to begin our session?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you for your introduction. And I'm just trying to get my PowerPoint going so that I can share it. Just give me a second. Okay, so I will share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay,
Success.
very good. Very good. Okay, hello everyone. It's good to be here. And thank you to all of you who are involved in organizing this. Thanks to Alexandra, Suni, and Vanessa, and all the others. The title of my presentation is Bringing Down the Heat and Human Rights to Bear on Climate Change, Childbirth, and Gender Equality. And I will proceed in 4 steps. So first, let me give you some preliminary remarks, and then I will talk about the evidence, women's rights, and then I have some concluding remarks on where to go from here. So first of all, this is about preterm birth as one aspect of adverse birth outcomes. So every year, an estimated 15 million babies are born preterm. And what do we understand by preterm? We understand a spontaneous live birth before 37 completed weeks of gestation. And the WHO tells us the numbers are rising. Obviously, preterm is just one aspect of complications. There's also the possibility of stillbirth, etc. But we focus here on preterm. And across 184 countries, the rate of preterm birth ranges from 5% to 18%. So it's quite a significant number. Now, all this I will discuss in the context of climate change. And the presupposition is that we talk about climate change, and also that the effect of climate change on pregnancy is mediated through extreme weather events, in particular through heat and heat waves. And here we clearly have, there's some research which tells us that current pledges mean that the children born now in 2020 and during their life course, they will experience a 7-fold increase in heat waves. So they will experience many more heat waves than we do at the moment. However, if these pledges are, or let's put it differently, coming back to the nationally determined contributions, if governments are serious about their commitments and keep down the temperature at 2.0 degrees or 1.5, then these lifetime exposures to heat waves will be much less. Still increased at, let's say, for 2.0 at 6-fold, there will be a 6-fold increase, or people will experience it 6 times more. And or if it's even further down, then it will be reduced, the exposure to heat waves. So that's important to see, because also it will have an effect on women and on pregnant women in particular. Now, this diagram nicely provides us with the context of what I will be talking about, namely the adverse effects of climate change on children's health. It starts before they are born, in fact, and it starts obviously in utero, and the abbreviation IUGR stands for intrauterine growth restrictions. So clearly, there is a vulnerable situation. Pregnant women are vulnerable, and depending on the environment, there are things which can happen to the baby, and they can lead to preterm delivery, but also they can lead to more long-term issues especially neurodevelopmental disorders or congenital infections, all kinds of things which are mentioned here, especially cardiovascular problems, and we come to that. Obviously, the earlier the delivery takes place, the higher the likelihood of negative outcomes. And also, preterm obviously is being dealt with quite nicely in the global north, but it's a different story in the global south. And the other thing we need to be clear about is that preterm birth, even if it's taken care of, it might have long-term consequences up until adulthood, and even in further generations through epigenetics. And there is increasing research on this one. And basically, the outcomes seem to support this, what is called the paradigm of developmental origins of disease. And we can talk about that more. So basically, what I started out with is some research which has been published recently in the journal Pediatrics and Perinatal Epidemiology. And these studies covered research in Australia and in Texas, Houston, for example. And was quite clear, especially for the research by Cushing on the birth of 200,000 pregnant women who have given birth between 2007 and 2011. It was quite clear that the risk of preterm birth was 15% higher after extremely hot days, meaning around 40 degrees Celsius. And that despite the fact that the population under scrutiny there was quite used to health impact. And there are a number of studies which basically confirm that, but most studies are actually about pregnant women in the north. I mean, they're quite reliable because they cover hundred thousands of women who have given birth. But I was interested also to see what's going on in the global south, especially in low and middle income countries. And here I came across a study by McElroy and colleagues, and she covered like 14 countries, low and middle income countries, among them also South Africa. And you can see also the temperature she was looking at, the threshold between 24 degrees and 43, because obviously when we talk about the impact of high temperature, it's always about comparison. And basically what her research resulted in is basically a confirmation also of the increase of the risk of preterm if temperatures are rising. And here is a diagram which shows us that around 20 degrees and higher, the risk ratio of preterm birth due to extreme heat is also increasing. And what is interesting in this case is also that she observed that there was a difference between urban areas and rural areas. And previous research also by Cushing has shown that there are differentials in socioeconomic status. Also, women with lower levels of education had a higher risk of delivering a preterm baby. So this is to say, preterm birth is a serious matter. And sometimes, and it is also researched in connection with air pollution, obviously, and the extreme heat is certainly not the only outcome of climate change, or where climate change shows impact. So air pollution is an important research area, and PM stands for particulate matter. So that's basically what comes along with the air pollution. Now, what are septal effects? Septal effects are problems with the heart, congenital effects. It's basically, septum means wall. So you have the upper walls in the heart and the lower walls. And these, or the upper chambers, I should say, and the lower chambers, and both of these chambers are separated by walls. And what happens here is that these walls might have a hole. So congenital heart defect would be a hole in one of these walls. Now, what the research discovered is that that air pollution, these particulate matter, contributed to this impact of extreme heat, and the higher or the longer the extreme heat was enduring, the more the effect of these particulate matters of the air pollution actually also played a role. And I found that quite extraordinary. And you can see it here on these on the slide. So you have on the left hand the increase in the heat day, and then you have the odds ratio, the probability that in fact there is a preterm birth is rising as well. So, and that is due to this impact of particulate matters. Okay, so basically what we see then with a range of studies, and the two studies I just mentioned, they're really just a part of a bigger set of studies, but obviously there is some lack of data when it comes to the global south. But nonetheless, this study by McElroy is very interesting because it matches meteorological data with actually a survey where women have been asked about their pregnancies and birth histories for dating back or between 2009 and 2014 or 18, I believe. So what these studies show then is that they provide us with the evidence that heat and high temperatures are not only associated with higher rates of preterm birth, but also with low birth weight, stillbirth, and neonatal and adverse child health. And it's also clear that overall pregnant women are much more vulnerable to climate hazards, extreme weather events, and undernutrition. Now, I mention here undernutrition because that's another element which comes into play, just like air pollution, but undernutrition plays a role, obviously, more in the global south. And here it is. We are talking here about heat stress. And what I've tried to show is that already we see significant impact through heat stress in terms of the preterm birth. And that has health outcomes, immediate ones and long-term ones. But if we add undernutrition, then the picture gets more complex. And we will also see, we need to take into account all these children undernourished here, 690 million. And who knows how many among them have been delivered preterm. But definitely, if there's so much undernutrition, it will mean that somehow pregnant women in the global south are affected by undernutrition. And it does, again, it adds to the severity of consequences these children might experience as children or even as adults. I think this is something which hasn't been really, is not so much on the radar. These impacts of climate change are often more looked at statically, like at the moment, but not in the long term. And now with this research, we have really foreseeable harms, and they need to be avoided. And that brings us to rights. And obviously women's rights and the rights community, international human rights law, has taken on board women's rights in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And for our purposes, obviously, the general recommendation number 37 on gender-related dimensions of disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change is absolutely vital. In addition, we have now this Human Rights Council resolution, which recognizes the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And that's fantastic. Also, because already we see the committee on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, we see it applying actually this general recommendation in the concluding observations when they review countries' performance in the context with regard to women's rights. So that's a good, good development. And even further, we can push it here because obviously there's one group of women which is even often experiences higher degrees of vulnerability, namely indigenous women. And thankfully, we have now the committee drafting a general recommendation on the rights of indigenous women and girls. And what I found so interesting and very helpful in the context of my research is that they address climate change related foreseeable human rights harms. And clearly, there are these major obligations of states to mitigate climate change and to adapt, limiting negative human rights impacts. And the third element, obviously also going back to the Paris Agreement, is then to remedy loss and damage. But the mitigation element brings us back to the NDCs we heard about. But it possibly could also bring us to climate change litigation when it comes to providing evidence for climate harms. And often judges rely more on, or they want to see immediate harm or even at least imminent harm. But I think with the research, a case can be made also in terms of foreseeable human rights harms and the need to avoid them and the possibility actually to do something about them through reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. I thought I had a slide here, but it's not coming up. Sorry. Here we go. So this is to show the overall picture. What I've tried to show here is really a limited segment of what climate change does to human health. I try to expand a little to air pollution, which is here, and to malnutrition, and often the combination of the two makes things much more difficult for children and women affected by it. But I think it's important to see this impacts, and in all these areas we have serious research, but I don't see it at the moment really being taken into account. The focus seems to be still more on the ecosystem rather than on the human system. And what we see here is actually that not only does climate change create irreversible harm in the ecosystem, but also it potentially creates irreversible harm in the human system. I think this is important to see, and it's not much on the radar. And obviously this effect comes because we are also seeing a double disruption. We see climate disruption on the material level and the physical level and the ecosystem, but literally a preterm birth due to climate change is a developmental disruption which can have serious consequences. Now, what to do about it? Here it is. The problem is clear, but we need to really take it on board. Preterm birth and its consequences. And I didn't even talk about stillbirth, but the effects on development, on brain development in particular, but also possible outcomes regarding cardiovascular disease or renal problems in adulthood cannot be discounted. And this brings us really back to what we can do and should do as advocates for gender equality with regard to climate change, but also as advocates for women's rights in this context. Global reduction in air pollution emissions is crucial, and the national determined contributions play a critical role. And it's true, there's still room for improvement in terms of gender considerations in the NDCs, but even if they are mentioned at the moment, there's in terms of quality, there's quite a range of things. So sometimes the word is mentioned and not much more in terms of the pathways to be taken. Clearly crucial is divestment from fossil fuels and also the reduction of toxic exposures. We have seen what air pollution can do to the heart, and that's not good for the child. Well, that's what I have to contribute, but I will not leave you without saying that highlighting these long-term cardiovascular consequences, and cardiovascular are just one important one. There's renal consequences or neurodevelopmental consequences in the long term. Basically, and we have enough research now which confirms this paradigm in terms of what I mentioned earlier, the developmental origin of health and disease. And we need to do something about climate change if we want to provide more quality for future generations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Thomas. That was a rich and interesting paper. I want to save the questions, which I know and comments, which I know there would be several for the end. Let's go directly on to Raluca Andreescu for her paper next.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello everyone. I'm very happy to participate in this event. I'm going to share my screen now. I hope you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.